December 29th, 1170. The icy breath of the English winter seeps through the towering walls of Canterbury Cathedral, wrapping its ancient stones in silence. Candlelight flickers across polished armor as 4 knights agents of the crown stride into the sacred heart of Christendom. Their swords clang softly against metal as they pass through the nave, every footstep echoing like a war drum on holy ground. Ahead of them, standing near the altar in his vestments, is a man once so powerful, so untouchable, that kings once called him brother. He is Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, former Chancellor, former best friend to King Henry II, and in moments, he will be brutally slaughtered at the foot of the cross. What follows is not just a murder, it is a desecration, a political earthquake, and the beginning of a legend that would haunt England for centuries. One knight raises his sword and brings it down upon Becket's skull. The blow cracks the silence and the bone beneath. Becket collapses to his knees, blood trickling down his face, still alive, still refusing to flee. Another sword crashes down, then another, and then one final swing so powerful that it splits his head open entirely, sending fragments of his brain splattering across the cold cathedral floor. The knights leave him there, lifeless in his own sacred sanctuary. Behind them, they leave not only a mutilated corpse, but a wound in the soul of England. Why did this happen? How could the closest advisor to a king become his greatest obstacle? What made Thomas Becket abandon royal luxury for martyrdom? And what dark command from Henry drove 4 men to commit holy murder without ever hearing the words "kill him"? This was more than an act of violence. It was a war between church and crown, between loyalty and belief, between power and conscience. And at the center was a man who transformed from a lavish courtier into a spiritual warrior so uncompromising that he forced a king to his knees, literally. The story of Thomas Becket is not just about death. It is about power gone mad, friendship gone wrong, and the high cost of standing up for what you believe when doing so means defying a throne. Stay with us, because what happened inside Canterbury Cathedral that day would not only change the fate of a nation, it would echo through history like the clash of swords in stone, immortalizing a man whose blood made him a saint, and whose silence after death spoke louder than any king. Before he became a martyr, before the altar of Canterbury was soaked in his blood, Thomas Becket was simply a boy from the bustling streets of London, the son of a Norman merchant, not born into nobility, not destined for greatness, and yet, somehow, this middle-class child would rise to become the second most powerful man in England. His ascent wasn't built on armies or bloodlines, it was forged through intellect, ambition, and a dangerous friendship with a king. Born around 1120, Becket grew up in a world still reeling from the Norman conquest. His parents, Gilbert and Matilda, were respectable but unremarkable people who could afford education, but not power. Still, young Thomas had something rare, a mind as sharp as a blade and a charm that disarmed even the most hardened aristocrats. He studied in Paris, then Bologna centers of medieval learning, where he absorbed law, theology, and diplomacy with almost surgical precision. But knowledge alone wasn't enough to open the doors of power. For that, Becket needed a patron. That man was Theobald of Bec, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who quickly saw in Thomas a weapon, a man who could be shaped and sent into political battle. Theobald entrusted him with diplomatic missions across Europe, a baptism by fire that would sharpen Becket's skills and make him indispensable. Then, in 1154, the wheel of fortune turned. A new king took the English throne. Henry II, just 21, fiery, brilliant, and bent on reforming and centralizing royal authority. Theobald, understanding the moment, recommended Becket for the role of Lord Chancellor, essentially the king's right hand. Henry accepted. No one knew then that he had just set the stage for one of the most tragic friendships in English history. At first, The alliance was perfect. Henry ruled with his sword, Becket with his pen. The two men were inseparable, drinking, hunting, laughing, scheming together. Chroniclers compared them to brothers, twins in power. Becket, once a commoner, now lived like royalty. He wore silks, commanded a private army, and threw lavish feasts that outshone nobles. But beneath the laughter and loyalty was a ticking clock. Because Henry didn't just see Becket as a friend, he saw him as a tool, a loyal servant to extend his reach into the church. What Henry never understood, what no king ever understands until it's too late, is this: you can raise a man up, but you cannot predict who he will become when he finally sees the throne from your height. When Henry II appointed Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, he believed he was making his boldest move, yet a political checkmate. After all, who better to control the church than the very man who had once toasted beside him, ridden into battle at his side, and loyally enforced his royal will as chancellor? It was a brilliant plan, on paper, but the moment Becket's hands were anointed, he became a man Henry no longer recognized. What was supposed to be a puppet turned prophet. What was meant to be a crown's extension became its fiercest challenger, and the cost of that transformation would be nothing short of war. Almost overnight, the silk robes and jeweled rings vanished. Becket shed his courtly glamour like a serpent's skin. Under his new vestments, he wore a hair shirt, an itchy, painful symbol of penance, worn directly against the skin. The man who once dined on roasted swan and fine wine now fasted in solitude, whipping himself at night in private acts of spiritual discipline. This wasn't for show. Or if it was a performance so total that even his enemies couldn't tell where the role ended and the conviction began. It was as if, by stepping into the office, Thomas Becket had not just changed positions, he had changed souls. But his transformation wasn't just physical or spiritual, it was political and devastatingly strategic. Becket resigned as chancellor, severing his loyalty to the king with a single, thunderous gesture. "I now serve only God," he declared. Then, like a man rewriting his past in fire, he began to overturn royal decisions he himself had previously approved, reclaiming church lands, challenging secular authority, and openly defying the king's efforts to control the clergy. For Henry, it was betrayal of the deepest kind. Not only had Becket turned on him, he had turned into something Henry feared most, a man who placed divine law above the will of the crown. What drove this transformation? Was it guilt conviction? A thirst for legacy? Some called it a holy awakening. Others whispered it was political theater. But one thing was certain. Henry had gambled with loyalty and lost to something stronger: faith. And as Becket rose higher in moral authority, he cast a shadow over the throne itself. This wasn't just about church versus crown. This was personal. Two men, one faith, and now, a line in the sand that neither would ever cross without blood. The transformation of Thomas Becket wasn't just a personal rebirth, it was the spark that ignited a political inferno across England. As Archbishop, Becket no longer stood beside the king, he now stood in his way. And at the heart of their escalating feud was a question that had haunted Europe for centuries: who holds ultimate authority, God's church or the king's crown? In the 12th century, this wasn't a philosophical debate, it was a battleground. And for Henry II, a king determined to unify and modernize England under royal law, the existence of a separate, untouchable church authority was not only inconvenient, it was intolerable. The immediate flashpoint was the Constitutions of Clarendon, a set of laws Henry proposed in 1164. These weren't mere reforms. They were an attempt to clip the wings of the church and drag it beneath royal jurisdiction. Chief among them was a provision that clergy accused of crimes, whether theft, assault, or even murder, would be tried in royal courts, not ecclesiastical ones. Until then, priests enjoyed what many saw as a divine loophole. They were judged by church courts, which rarely imposed harsh penalties. To Henry, this was legal chaos. To Becket, it was spiritual treason. At first, Becket appeared to bend. Under immense pressure, he agreed reluctantly to the king's reforms. But something shifted. Days later, he recanted his approval, publicly refusing to sign the constitutions. For Henry, this was the ultimate humiliation. His own former friend, now haloed in priestly authority, was undermining him on the world stage. What followed was a brutal campaign of retaliation. Becket was summoned to royal court, accused of treason and stripped of property. Threatened with imprisonment or worse, he fled to France, beginning a 6-year exile that turned a political standoff into an international crisis. While in France, Becket did not fade into obscurity. He became a symbol, one that Pope Alexander III eagerly supported, backed by the French king and armed with the threat of excommunication. Becket pushed the church's cause across borders. His struggle wasn't just Becket versus Henry anymore. It was Rome versus the English throne, a spiritual war wrapped in the robes of diplomacy. Every letter Becket sent, every defiance he made, deepened the divide, and every day in exile, he grew more dangerous not in sword, but in symbol. Because kings fear one thing more than rebellion, a martyr in the making, draped not in armor, but in righteousness. After 6 long years in exile, Thomas Becket returned to England not as a broken man, but as a walking storm. He had left as a defiant archbishop fleeing royal wrath, but came back a spiritual titan, cloaked in papal authority and popular reverence. It was December 1170, and the air was thick with tension. Henry II, battered by threats of excommunication and desperate to contain the damage, had reluctantly agreed to a public reconciliation just months earlier. The two men had met in Normandy, exchanged formal words of forgiveness, and for a brief moment, it seemed the kingdom might hold together. But beneath the polite gestures and hollow smiles, nothing had truly changed. If anything, Becket was more resolute than ever, and Henry more volatile. Becket's return was anything but quiet. Instead of laying low, he launched straight into action. Reasserting his authority and sending a clear message to the throne, the church bows to no king. His boldest move, excommunicating the bishops who had helped crown Henry's son, a ceremony traditionally reserved for the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. It wasn't just a spiritual slap in the face, it was a direct challenge to Henry's power and legitimacy. These were not anonymous priests, these were the king's allies. And Becket had just declared them damned. The response was immediate. The excommunicated bishops rushed to Henry's court in Normandy, their outrage stoking an already simmering fury. And then, in one of the most infamous moments of medieval history, Henry II exploded, whether spoken in anger, sarcasm, or command. His words would change history forever. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Or as another chronicler recorded, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished who let this man treat me with such shame?" The room fell silent, but the meaning rang loud. 4 knights, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton heard what they believed was a royal command. They didn't ask for clarification. They didn't wait. They mounted their horses, crossed the Channel, and headed straight for Canterbury. And just like that, diplomacy died. Whatever fragile peace had existed, shattered in an instant, replaced by a grim, wordless mission. Becket had drawn his line in the sand, and now, armed with steel and blind loyalty, the king's men would answer. What neither Henry nor the knights understood was this: they weren't just marching to silence a priest. They were about to create a saint. The knights arrived in Canterbury cloaked in the chill of late December. But it was not winter that froze the hearts of those who saw them. It was the certainty of their purpose. They weren't just visitors. They were executioners cloaked in royal ambiguity. They went first to the Archbishop's residence and demanded that Thomas Becket lift the excommunications. Calm, defiant, Becket refused, not with anger, not with fear, but with the steady conviction of a man who had already made peace with death. The knights stormed out to retrieve their weapons. The monks begged Becket to flee, to hide, to let them bolt the cathedral doors. But Becket shook his head. "This is God's house, not a fortress," he said. "I will not run." And with that, he walked knowingly into the jaws of history. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the great cathedral fell into candlelit stillness, the knights returned, swords drawn, boots clanging across sacred stone. Becket stood near the altar, cloaked in archiepiscopal robes, his back straight, his eyes unflinching. Again, they ordered him to submit. Again, he refused. Reginald Fitzurse attempted to drag him away, but Becket clung to a column, grounded like a saint carved in marble. Then came the first blow, a steel blade crashing down on his head, drawing blood onto holy ground. A monk named Edward Grimm leapt forward to shield him, his arm nearly severed by the force. What followed was not a fight, but a butchering. The second strike cracked Becket's skull, the third sent him to his knees. The fourth split his head open completely, scattering bone and brain onto the cathedral floor. The final blow was so savage, so absolute, that the assassin's sword broke on the stone beneath him. Silence fell, but not peace. One knight leaned down, and with the cold detachment of a butcher, drove the tip of his sword into Becket's exposed skull, spreading his brains like ash across the altar. "He will rise no more," one of them said, and with that, they vanished into the shadows. But the blood they spilled did not dry with the passing night. It became ink, writing a legend of defiance and sacrifice that would echo through time. In trying to silence Becket, they immortalized him. The man who walked into a cathedral and refused to bow would now kneel forever in memory, a martyr crowned not by kings, but by conscience. The moment Thomas Becket's blood touched the stones of Canterbury Cathedral, England itself began to tremble. The news of his murder didn't travel, it erupted. Within days, word had spread across the kingdom and beyond. An archbishop had been butchered at the altar by knights who claimed to serve the king. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a catastrophe. The killing wasn't seen as a political act, it was branded sacrilege, a direct assault on the church, on God himself. And as shock turned to outrage, the question became unavoidable. Had King Henry II ordered the death of a saint? Whether he meant it or not. Henry's infamous outburst, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" had become a death sentence. The Pope responded swiftly and decisively. The four assassins were excommunicated, declared enemies of the church, and forced to flee into obscurity. But worse still for Henry, the Vatican now turned its eyes on him. There was talk of placing all of England under interdict, suspending all religious services, halting baptisms, marriages, even funerals. For a medieval monarch, this wasn't just spiritual pressure, it was political suicide. A king who lost the favor of the church risked losing the loyalty of his people. So, Henry did what no proud ruler ever wants to do. He begged forgiveness. In 1174, nearly 4 years after the murder, the most powerful man in England walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury, dressed in a rough woolen sackcloth, blood already drawn from stones in his feet. At the cathedral, he knelt before Becket's tomb and allowed each monk to flog him one by one. That image, a king whipped by the hands of the church, was more than penance. It was submission. It was theater. And it worked. Public opinion shifted. Henry avoided excommunication. But the price was high. He was forced to revoke parts of the constitutions of Clarendon, conceding greater autonomy to the church. Clergy once again remained shielded from royal courts, and Becket, the man he tried to erase, rose in death far higher than he ever had in life. Miracles were soon reported at the site of his martyrdom. Pilgrims came by the thousands. In 1173, just 3 years after his death, Thomas Becket was canonized. The man Henry had tried to control, then silence, had now become a saint and a symbol, and no king, no matter how powerful, could ever unmake a martyr. Thomas Becket may have died on the cold stone floor of Canterbury Cathedral, but his presence only grew stronger with every drop of blood spilled. In the years following his brutal murder, Becket didn't just become a saint, he became a phenomenon. Reports of miracles began to circulate almost immediately. The sick were healed by touching his relics. The blind claimed to see again after praying at his tomb, and even the paralyzed walked away from the very spot where his skull had been shattered. These weren't whispers, they were testimonies, carried by pilgrims, priests, and nobles alike. And so began one of the most powerful religious movements in medieval Europe, the cult of St. Thomas Becket. By 1173, just 3 years after his death, the church canonized him, an astoundingly fast recognition that spoke less to Rome's speed and more to the sheer pressure of public devotion. Becket's shrine in Canterbury soon became the beating heart of medieval pilgrimage. People came from across England, from France, from the Holy Roman Empire, not just to pray, but to witness. The site became sacred ground, and Becket became a living legend in death. For the poor, he was a protector. For the sick, a healer. For kings and bishops, a haunting reminder that no throne is safe from conscience. So powerful was his legacy that it inspired one of the most influential literary works in the English language, the Canterbury Tales, by Geoffrey Chaucer. Written 2 centuries later, the story follows a group of pilgrims, each with their own tale, journeying to Becket's shrine. The destination wasn't just spiritual, it was cultural. To visit Canterbury was to walk in the shadow of a man who defied a king and paid with his life. But not all kings welcomed that shadow. In 1538, during the English Reformation, Henry VIII, in a bitter echo of his royal predecessor, ordered the destruction of Becket's shrine. It was torn down, his relics burned, and his name erased from prayer books. Why? Because Becket's memory still held power. Because a martyr, even in death, is a threat to tyrants. But history is a poor accomplice to censorship. And though his tomb was destroyed, his story endured. To this day, pilgrims and tourists still visit the very spot where Thomas Becket fell. A modern sword marks the place not just as a memorial, but as a warning carved into stone: silence the righteous, and they will only speak louder from the grave. Centuries have passed since Thomas Becket's skull was shattered beneath the vaulted ceilings of Canterbury Cathedral. Yet his story continues to echo, not just through stained glass and stone, but through the very fabric of how we think about power, principle, and the price of conviction. Becket's legacy endures not because of the way he died, but because of what his death came to mean. In an age when kings ruled by divine right, he dared to suggest that even the highest throne was not above moral accountability. And that idea, radical, dangerous, and utterly human, is why he still matters. Becket's martyrdom didn't just shift the balance of power in medieval England. It redefined the boundary between church and state, forcing monarchs to recognize that spiritual authority could not be dictated by royal decree. The backlash to his murder led to concessions from Henry II, changes in English law, and a permanent cautionary tale etched into political memory. But beyond the laws and rituals, Becket became a symbol, a man who chose conscience over comfort, loyalty to principle over loyalty to power. He reminds us that real courage is not loud, it is silent, defiant, and often suicidal. For modern American audiences, Becket's story isn't some distant medieval tragedy, it's a mirror. We still wrestle with the tension between institutional power and personal belief, between loyalty to systems and loyalty to what's right, whether it's whistleblowers challenging governments, citizens standing up to corruption, or individuals refusing to compromise their ethics in the face of pressure. The ghost of Becket walks among us. His life asks us, what do you serve when your job, your reputation, or even your safety is on the line? And his death answers with chilling clarity. If your truth is only valid when it's easy, then it's not really truth at all. Becket also teaches us about the danger of reckless words spoken by the powerful. Henry II never gave a direct order to kill, but his frustrated outburst, emotionally charged, politically toxic, was enough to unleash irreversible violence. It's a reminder that words have weight, especially when spoken from a podium, a pulpit, or a throne. In a world where rhetoric spreads faster than facts, and where influence is currency, Becket's blood-soaked floor becomes a warning. A careless phrase from the powerful can become someone else's justification for cruelty. Ultimately, the man who defied a king became something more than saint or martyr. He became a symbol of moral resistance, an idea that no matter how high the pressure, how lethal the threat, integrity is worth everything, even your life. If this story moved you, if Thomas Becket's courage and sacrifice made you think about power, faith, or standing up for what's right, don't just scroll past. Leave a comment and tell us, would you have made the same choice in his place? Save this video to revisit later. And make sure to subscribe for more untold stories that history tried to silence. Every like, comment, and share helps us bring these forgotten voices back to life, and we promise the next chapter will be just as shocking.